Welcome. I'm going to start the second part of this three-part series on the effects of trauma on young children now. And I'll again introduce myself. I'm Boris. I'm the Chief for Behavioral Health here at Boris Children's Hospital in Orlando. And it's a pleasure to be with you. The second talk here is going to delve into attachment. And it's a core social and emotional system in early childhood. And as we learned from the first talk, social and emotional development is critical not just for the young child, but is a foundation for that child's health across time. And again, the work of James Heckman is so important in our understanding of that, which as we delve further into research will only grow. So we're here again at Boris Children's Hospital in Orlando to think about attachment and its importance, both from a broader perspective and for the many of you out there who work with young children with high-risk families, to really hone down on our understanding of what is attachment and how do we think about it as a provider. So I've put together another saying for this part of the talk. It's from Frederick Douglass, a great American, who said long ago, "It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." An important concept. Now, we talked in the last section about the widening gap in society and the way Heckman thinks about that gap from the perspective of an economist. And we asked this question about what are the things that hinder social and emotional development in early childhood, and how might we promote social and emotional development in early childhood. What's clear, of course, is that the hindrance piece refers to our adverse childhood experiences. And the ACEs study that we reviewed in the last section is really critical in our understanding. But let's talk about the other side of this question, what promotes social and emotional development in early childhood. Now, before we do that, I'm going to bring another video in, not give much of a lead into it, just ask you to watch it and think about what we might understand from this video.
Baby. Does Mommy's nose scare you when I blow it? Does that scare you when Mommy blows her nose? Yeah? You silly baby.
Now, as you saw there, that's a charming infant. He actually looks to be about the same age as my youngest child, somewhere in the range of 6 months to a year. And as you can see, this baby is reacting rather dramatically to a typical life event, mom blowing her nose. Only YouTube can bring us this kind of material. But what we really do understand, not from this video, because you see the baby laugh and enjoy the interaction with mom until the nose blows happen, but we do know that children are directly impacted by traumatic experiences, even very young children. And so to see a child recoil in fear, as you just witnessed, reminds us that those systems, those emotion systems, are evident early in life. In fact, what's fascinating is that we're understanding about how physiological arousal of a mother during pregnancy can influence the children's behavior even many years later. And so some of the newest data in this arena are really quite striking. suggesting here that neurohormonal effects on young children can be dramatic, and these can be triggered by experience. So if we say that trauma can influence very young children, and we say that adverse experiences have tremendous health effects across time, we're really beginning to suggest that what we need to be doing is figuring out how recovery from traumatic experiences can be promoted. I said in the previous talk that it would be great if we could essentially rid the world of adverse childhood experiences. But given that we don't invest in prevention programs the way we might need to, we're going to be stuck repairing traumatic experiences, and that's an important concept. Now, we might argue, well, what exactly defines a traumatic experience in early childhood? This picture here may get us to think about who's traumatized. I certainly would suggest that the artist who's holding the marker aloft has not been traumatized by this particular interaction, but perhaps the little baby has. It's a little hard to tell. And I don't want to make light of trauma too much. I'll tell you that I got this picture emailed to me, and the heading and subject line in the email was "Why Men Shouldn't Babysit." And I feel like that's a bit of a sexist concept, but there are a series of pictures, and here's another one. This is clearly trauma, okay? And so bringing a child to see Santa Claus's gravesite is clearly a deep and traumatic experience, and you can see how this may have affected the preschool child. Now, I don't want to make light of it because, in fact, as I said, traumatic experiences are evident early in childhood. And the poet W.H. Auden once wrote, I think very tellingly from a psychological perspective, a poem that included these lines: "Violence shall synchronize your movements like a tune, and terror, like a frost, shall halt the flood of thinking." Now, what's interesting again is that we understand the capacities of even very young infants so much better now in the last 20 or 25 years than I think at any time. And this really has to do with scientific study of these very capacities. What we understand is that infants and young children are phenomenal in terms of social interaction. They are hardwired to seek out these kinds of interactions. And this is a set of pictures from Andrew Meltzer's lab. He studies imitation in newborn babies, babies in the first weeks of life, and can show quite clearly that these babies in a quiet, restful state have the amazing capacity to imitate facial expressions of their caregivers, as you see here. And what happens as time goes on is that early imitation is just a rudimentary capacity, but sharing of affect and that social and emotional development piece goes on through the first year of life into the toddler period, where nonverbal signals guide infants' behaviors. And what we understand now, really from a neuroscientific perspective, that what's happening here is that caregivers are literally helping to shape babies' brains. This is a picture from a book written by Alan Shore and published quite a while ago now, almost 15 years, in which he began to break apart the neurobiology of interactions in children, but also in animal studies. And what we, again, have the capacity to understand is how emotions are developed and regulated in young children through interaction with others. This is the mutual regulation thing that we talked about in the first talk today. So let's take a look at another video. One of the kinds of studies done in the last 25 years on young children, called the visual cliff experiment, where we again understand how infants and young children use social signals to guide their behavior and really to help them predict what will come from different experiences.
In the experiment, babies between 9 and 12 months are placed on a large plexiglass-topped table. Half of the table has a checkerboard pattern just underneath the surface, which the baby thinks is plenty safe to crawl on. But halfway across is a visual cliff, which the baby can tell drops off steeply. The plexiglass top continues, so we know it's perfectly fine to proceed. But the baby isn't so sure, and this is a big drop for a baby just starting to crawl. She wants to get across to get the toy, but she's learned to be cautious from dealing with stairs and such. This is where the adult comes in.
In this particular investigation, what we attempted to understand is the extent to which the nonverbal, facial communication coming from the mother to the child powerfully affected that baby's behavior. If the mother is posing a fear face, the baby typically does not cross this stair step downward, this modified visual cliff or visual step. On the other hand, if the mother poses a smile or somehow poses a nonverbal communication that is not prohibitive but encouraging, the child is much more likely to cross over to her. This particular study demonstrates the role of nonverbal communication in determining the child's behavior in uncertain contexts.
So what's fascinating about this video is that the parent's fear face influences the child's in-the-moment decision about what they're going to do, whether they pursue the attractive toy or not. And so we see that young babies not only can show fear on their faces, as we saw from the previous video, but also can recognize signals of fear before the age of 1 year in their caregivers. And so for us who work with high-risk families, we understand that a parent's expectations about their child and about their own experiences in relationships begin to, in effect, flow on to their young infants. So here I have a bubble over mom who says about her young son, he's just like his daddy, gentle and calm. And we can easily imagine another parent in another situation who thinks of her young son, well, he's just like his daddy and he's already getting out of control. And so for parents who themselves experience things like violence in the family, that violence impacts them and how they relate to their children, and also impacts their children directly. So in effect, young children experience negative events through the caregiver and directly, almost as if it were a double whammy. Now, if we say, okay, well then how do we shape positive social and emotional development in early childhood? I'll take us to this map, which essentially is a summary of the attachment system, and we'll delve into that more now. This is a model called the circle of security. And if we were argued to parents who've experienced negative events themselves or whose children have been exposed to such events, what they needed to do for their child, we might simply just show them this map. And we might argue, as John Bowlby did, the father of attachment theory, that what a caregiver needs to do is to be a secure base and safe haven for their child. They need to be able to let their child explore, and as their children go out to explore the world, which they will do without anything but simple support, that those children may need to be watched over, to be helped, to be enjoyed with or delighted in. When the children return to them, perhaps because they're tired, frustrated, or alarmed by something, then the caregiver can become a safe haven by providing protection, comfort, delight, and organizing that child's feelings. If we want to think about promoting social and emotional development, then we're going to think about helping parents to learn what their children's needs are on this circle of security. So we might ask ourselves, well, what is this thing we call attachment? If that's a roadmap to how to develop secure attachment, let's think about what attachment is from the scientific perspective. When the theory was first put forth, it was argued by Bowlby that this was an inborn system. In other words, that effectively it was a biological propensity in humans. Now, he came to that understanding through animal studies, and we'll delve into that in a moment. But what he said was, look, attachment has capacity to operate throughout the lifespan. This is not something that only happens in infancy and early childhood, but all of us carry around with us this attachment system throughout adulthood. And that in infancy, the goal is this balancing of exploration, this going out on the top half of the circle and returning to the caregiver on the bottom. And when children have a very predictable, safe, and secure caregiver, then they will achieve a sense of felt security, a sense of capacity, and in effect, we will be promoting their human capital, to use Heckman's phrase. Now, when we say a biobehavioral system, and we talk about the animal studies that Bowlby based his theory on, I mean, one of the key proponents was a guy named Konrad Lorenz who studied geese. And he did this in the 1950s, and he discovered that geese imprint very early in life, as babies, on what's in front of them, visually. And they will then follow that figure around, be it the scientist or a mother goose, depending on who's there. And so this is a picture that you might find in a psychology textbook that reviews the roots of attachment theory. This is a fellow named Harry Harlow here. He did experiments with rhesus monkeys that further developed the understanding of what attachment is across species. And here we had the idea that, in fact, this system is linked to natural selection, that the capacity to provide protection for young is effectively pushed forward by evolutionary forces. The theory is based on observations between our friend Konrad Lorenz, this guy Harry Harlow, and many others who did animal studies. Now, here's a slide from the far side of when imprinting studies go awry. Here's the scientist imprinting on the goose and following the goose around. And obviously, this just helps us remind it that, in fact, humans are more complex than geese, and that our attachment system isn't a visual system. It's a system that's based on serial experiences, okay? And so attachment happens in early childhood through transactions with others. Now, as we've learned across now what's 3 or 4 decades of research regarding really what does the exchange between a caregiver and an infant mean, and why is it important to the species, thinkers like Peter Fonagy, who's quoted here, have really helped us understand this on a deeper level. I'm going to read this quote to you. It's a long one, it's a complex one, but I think it's an important one for our own understanding. Fonagy says, as our understanding of the interface of brain development and early psychosocial experience increases, we see the role of the attachment relationship as far more than being there to protect the human infant. It also fulfills an evolutionary role in ensuring that the brain structures that come to subserve social cognition are appropriately organized, and prepared to equip the individual for the collaborative existence with conspecifics for which his or her brain was designed. Only someone who studies psychoanalysis could write a quote this complicated, so I thought I'd share it with you in whole. You might want a translation of it, so we'll say what Fonagy's arguing here is that attachment experiences shape our social brains. And that social cognition is really what Heckman is talking about. It's the foundation of learning. It is the key to the soft skills that improve human capital. And this collaborative existence with conspecifics is really relationships. So what's so important in early childhood are stable, consistent, positive, and caring relationships. And if we want to promote our social brains, if we want those brains to develop regulation of emotions, then we need, in effect, to promote relationships early in childhood. Heckman says it a different way, but it really leads back to the same concept. So again, our circle of security becomes fundamental in our understanding of promoting social and emotional development and repairing traumatic experiences in early childhood. So when I'm asked to think about how to help children who've experienced adverse childhood experiences, maltreatment, violence in the home, exposure to a substance-using parent, and so on, then I'm going to return back to attachment-based interventions and return back to this map. How am I going to get a parent to become the secure base and safe haven for that young child? When parents disappear into a world of drug use, violence, and so on, and infants and toddlers are left alone to negotiate the circle without support, then that becomes a traumatic experience well beyond a simple direct trauma. And so it's easy for us to understand when we see young children expressing fear that they can experience fear. But when we think about things like disrupting early relationships, that is a very, very important further traumatic experience for these kids, and one which we see all too frequently. So that concludes the second of our talks today on trauma, and we'll get further into how do we think about programs and interventions to address these issues in the third. Thanks.